Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Aga Khan Centre. My name is Christopher Wilton-Steer, and I'm the Head of Communications of the Aga Khan Foundation UK. We've been lucky enough to call this beautiful building our home for over a year now, and have welcomed thousands of people through its doors, through events such as these, and through our public tours programme. The building was created as a place of education, knowledge, and cultural exchange. So we're delighted to be hosting this event that brings together such a diverse group around this important topic. As some of you may be aware, the Aga Khan Foundation is a charitable organisation that has worked with disadvantaged communities since it was established in 1967. We seek to do three things: improve the quality of life, enhance the self-reliance of the communities in which we serve, and to promote pluralism. At the heart of what we do is the education and empowerment of women and girls. It is in our DNA. In 1946, Sultan Muhammad Shah, His Highness the Aga Khan's grandfather, advised his community that if they could only afford to send one of their children to school, it should be one of their girls. Why? Because even 70 years ago, he was aware of the impact of an educated girl on her family, her community, and her society. Today, our education programmes reach over 1 million girls every year, and our health, economic inclusion and civil society programmes that put women at the centre of local decision-making reach several million more. In Afghanistan, with funding from DFID, we're currently delivering one of the largest girls' education programmes in the world that is supporting over 200,000 girls overcome the barriers to education and get to school and stay in school longer. In Portugal, we are piloting a new programme teaching young migrant women to code and gain employment in the tech sector. And all over East Africa, we're supporting the development of thousands of women-led savings groups that allow individuals to take out loans for emergency healthcare or to set up new businesses, to name just a few examples. On that note, I'd like to hand over to Sarah from Oxford HR and wish you an inspiring and productive morning session. If you have any questions, feel free to ask myself or my colleagues Nick McGrath and Sana Nalia, who are also here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Christopher. Hello everyone, welcome. I'm here to tell you a little bit about Oxford HR and what we do. I won't keep you too long. Oxford HR is a niche global executive search firm. We're focused on the for-purpose sector. We work with a range of public and third sector organisations to find and appoint great people into leadership positions. And 2020 will be our quarter centenary. So we've been going a while. We've grown from really small beginnings in Oxford to a team of 31, consisting of 14 different nationalities. And we're across globally now. We have offices in Oxford and London, Amsterdam and Nairobi. And in the coming year, we're aiming to land in Bangkok and Washington. So we're very proud that we are able to grow. And our strapline, you'll see from perhaps some of the documentation we've got around you, is search for a better world. That's a turn of phrase that always makes me smile. It has a lot of heart, and that's kind of sums up what we do as well and why we do it. Our intention is to work with integrity and collaboratively, with a genuine desire to improve both ourselves and how we work, but also our clients, either through the appointments that we make or by acting as critical friends, being brave enough to challenge prevailing cultural norms. Diversity, inclusion and social responsibility are important to us. We set our own targets of gender and black and ethnic minority candidates that we present a shortlist. At the moment this target is 35%, but we know that we need to do more here. Also, we know that diversity is a very broad term, and there are many underrepresented groups. We are aware of intersectionality as well, and at every opportunity we work proactively to support, coach and take positive action. One example I can share with you is some recent work that I did to find a chief executive, and I was working with a medium-sized charity. they work with underrepresented groups of people who are returning to work, and through many reasons, they might be returning to work because of they're recovering from drug addiction, or they might be homeless. So this is a coaching charity, and their CEO, I had 4 candidates at final interview for the CEO post, and I worked extremely hard with one of them because she felt that she was always second. She always came second. And she said to me, it's because I don't sound like everybody else. I don't sound like the people who come first and who win these chief executive roles. And I said to her, I can't promise anything, obviously, but if you sit down with me for coffee 3 times before the final interview, I will help you. You know, I'll hear your answers, and I'll try and give you some ideas as to how to reframe things so that you sound more confident. And I did. I offered everybody the chance for coffee, so it wasn't just her, but she took me up on it, and I'm pleased to say she was appointed, and she was delighted, and I am too, because she resonates very clearly with the people that the charity supports. But at the same time, she's confident in herself, and she's good at what she does. So anyway, that's a small example of one of the things that we've done. So some of the challenges that we're tasked with solving are not even really visible. They are often intrinsic, unspoken, and we have to, as consultants, engage, soften, often offer diplomatic suggestions, sort of weave our way into the heart of an issue, and be resilient, open, and tread a line between challenge and sometimes silent rage. But it's worth it because it's so rewarding when you feel like you're part of something that's changed for the better. And I would say that these core requirements, these qualities, this grace under fire, is something that you all have to demonstrate as well. Change, whatever kind of change, is not without discomfort. And you're here today not just for a nice breakfast and some lovely fruit, and to be in this lovely building that I've walked past many times, and I'm so pleased to be inside, but also because you know that you need solidarity to achieve this, and you know the hard graft that it's going to take to make any kind of positive change. And not only that, but you want to pull as you climb and make it easier for others to follow. So I'm inviting you to enjoy yourselves today, make the most of the free breakfast, networking, solidarity, chatting, enjoy yourselves and our lovely panellists. And if you'd like to hear more about Oxford HR, we are milling around the room, drinking coffee, we're around. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah and Christopher, and thank you to Oxford HR and to Aga Khan Foundation and the Aga Khan Centre both for hosting us, for sponsoring us and supporting us. We really appreciate it, and it was very fitting to hear of your perspectives around recruitment and around solidarity and diversity as well, which is very, very opening for the conversations we're going to be having today. I'm Charles Keedon. For those that don't know me, I'm editor of Alliance. I'm really delighted to have you all here today on polling day. Thank you for making it in, so many of you, for this discussion around feminist philanthropy. The Wi-Fi here is education123 with a capital E, and the hashtag we're using is feminist philanthropy, so feel free if you want to tweet or post comments as you hear some of the discussion. The objective of today, as with all our Breakfast Club discussions, is to debate the topic which is at the centre of our issue, our special feature, and this special feature is devoted to feminism and feminist philanthropy. We'll be looking at some of the issues, controversies and trends, and there's some evaluation forms on your seat so you can tell us how well we've done in achieving that objective. I'm really delighted to have with me, alongside me, some really thoughtful practitioners and thinkers on this topic. On my left I have Dr. Awino, Okech, who's the Chair of the Centre for Gender Studies at SOAS, University of London. And then next to me, Swatee, Deepak, who's the Director of With and For Girls. And then on my right over there, I have Moira Sinclair, who's the Chief Executive of the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. So three, what will hopefully be different but complementary perspectives on these topics. I am going to stop talking in a moment, but I just want to say a few words about this issue to represent the voices of our guest editors, Issa Bosch and Ladana Bofu Tawamba. Issa is in Dry Linden, the granddaughter of Robert Bosch, the leading feminist practitioner. and philanthropist, and Nadana Bofri-Lwamba leads Urgent Action Fund, which works on women's rights across Africa. They can't be with us today because they're based out of the UK, so I want to just draw attention to a couple of the points in their lead article, which is on page 32 of the issue, before handing over to Awino, who will be talking about women's funds and drawing on some of the comments in her own contribution. They said to me, and I'm quoting, and it's quotes either from what they've said to me or in their own article, that funding women and girls is not enough. Philanthropy needs a feminist consciousness. Feminist philanthropy is a political act that seeks to transform the distribution of power, privilege and resources. And by that issue around power, they're talking about a more horizontal approach rooted in solidarity, a word we've already heard, mutual empowerment. How you behave is as important as how much you give. So how you behave when you're giving is important to them. And from them, that leads them to argue that there needs to be a dismantling of a more hierarchical form of philanthropy, which is predicated on power over to a more horizontal approach. So they think that approach will inform grant-making approaches and all interactions, indeed. They also argue that there needs to be a resourcing of movements intersectionally to address the underlying factors sustaining injustice. And they also suggest that gender justice points to ways to maybe decolonise philanthropy. They argue that when we enjoy privileges, what seems neutral is really not, and that northern-based philanthropy needs to get over its claims to be gender blind. They also say that there needs to be emphasis on the centrality of voices which are sometimes excluded from decisions that affect them, in particular young people. And at the heart of this issue is an interview with Frida, the Young Feminist Fund, which highlights some of the younger voices that aren't here today but are very present in this issue, particularly given that young people are going to be affected by climate change, by Brexit, and by other factors, even if they haven't had a say that arguably should have had. And then they also emphasise the role of women's funds as not the main, but one of the important bodies to building resilient, autonomous feminist institutions. So those are the views of Issa and Nadana, who set off this issue. And on that note, I'm delighted to pass over to Awino, who will speak for about 5 minutes, each of our panelists for 5 minutes each, and then we're going to get into a really good discussion about the issues raised. So thank you all for being here. Over to you, Awino.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for this invitation, both to speak but also to contribute to the magazine and this particular focus area. I think Dana would like you to know that she heads Urgent Action Fund Africa, because there are 3 or so sister funds, so UAF represents the US one. 3 main points that I wanted to make to open up the discussion. And the first is that I believe that the gift that feminist scholarship and feminist movements gave the world and gave the development sector was the language of gender. They gave us the tools to understand what gender means, to think about it outside the binary of male and female, to understand ideas around sexuality, power, and more importantly, the system of patriarchy. What black feminists, particularly from the US, added to that conversation was a discussion around multiple oppressions, which now, more recently, through the work of folks like Kimberly Crenshaw, we think about through the idea of intersectionality, which simply means that you cannot think about gender as something that operates alone. We have to think about race, we have to think about class as sets of identities and structural factors that come together into our experiences of being people in the world. I say all of this to make the point that anyone who is interested in addressing questions of gender equality cannot do so effectively without a structural analysis, cannot do so effectively without an understanding of the structural dynamics that shape oppression. Because if we do so through a surface understanding of what gender inequalities mean, what we end up doing is responding to the symptoms of the problem rather than the roots of the challenge. The roots of the challenge are patriarchy, which produces sexism. We can think about capitalism, which produces the sets of class-based inequalities. We can think about racism, which is rooted in broader ideas of white supremacy. So the arguments that I make around women's funds is that what they're offering to the world is a very clear approach to philanthropy that centers a feminist understanding of gender equality, that responds to inequalities from recognizing multiple oppressions and recognizing that if we are going to deal a blow to these huge systems that I'm referring to, then the work cannot be project-based. The work has to be based on an understanding of a long-term approach to resolving societal problems. It has to be based on an understanding of a response to these problems as one that is rooted at multi-levels, so the work across movements. It has to be one that recognizes that the work has to be multi-formed. And so this means that funding organizations or funding movements solely on the basis of a project. So there's a protest in Tahrir Square. We need money to do X, Y, and Z. You give that money and you walk away. It's not necessarily resolving the much longer term issues that require us to invest in relation to dealing with questions of gender equality. Much more recently, we have of course been forced to confront our sort of historical understandings of questions of gender and what that means, how we understand gender. Is it simply about masculinity and femininity? And there are wonderful articles that deal with that in the magazine, so I'll not necessarily spend too much time on that. I want to go back to the question of long-term funding as a sort of central point that women's funds and feminist funds in particular have focused on. Because this has meant that feminist funds have had to think quite seriously about the ways in which they structure their relationship with partners. They have had to think very seriously about reversing these ideas around organized organizations, structured organizations, or structured formations, if you will, as the only way to fund the work that needs to be done. So we are all now very used to talking about funding movements, thinking about movement building. All of us in the room are talking about this, but more often than not when we talk about movement building, we are still going to look for networks. We are still going to look for organizations that are registered. And the work of organizations such as Urgent Action Fund Africa and the UAF sister funds in particular, who are rapid response grant makers, really offers us an opportunity to think about what it means to be responsive to organizations, to movements, to societies, to women human rights defenders who do not necessarily exist within the confines of a registered organization, but who are actually doing a lot of substantive work with their communities, often at very high risk, often with limited structure within the context that they're working with, but whose work we must support. So I think this is the second core message and challenge to the room, that if we are deeply interested in funding structural transformation within our funding portfolios or within the institutions that we partner, what does it cause us to think about in relation to our structures, our call for fundings, the ways in which we think about partners, the kinds of reports that we demand for partners, and the kinds of accountability mechanisms that we put in place. Let's be clear, I'm not calling for us to not ask people to be accountable. If I give you £10 and you say you're giving it back to me, I will ask you to give it back to me. So I'm very clear about the fact that accountability is also not just about the money relationship, it's also about accountability to the communities and the people that we are working with. A final point before I end concerns the question of money and power. Now, I come from the school of thought that when I think about development funding or philanthropy, I think about that as reparations, which therefore means that this is a conversation about giving money to societies to get them to the place that they are not at because of our historical responsibilities in placing those societies where they are at now. So I don't necessarily think of development funding as a gift. I think of it as a conversation about building transnational solidarity amongst funding institutions, philanthropic foundations such as yourself, and international INGOs who are also doing this kind of work within the global south. This therefore means that in my view, I feel that feminist funds have done an incredible job of holding international bilateral organizations to think about their power and how that power translates to the ways in which they think about resourcing organizations. And some of the examples that I speak to in the article that I write about is leading from the South, which I believe is a manifestation of the power of Global South, women's rights organizations, and feminist funds in pushing back with a huge government to say, I'm sorry, I don't think that the approach that you have taken to funding gender is correct, and that you're actually putting money in the wrong place rather than putting money in the hands of the organizations and movements that have been doing this work for decades. I'd like to know.
And just on Leading from the South, before we go to Swatee, how much is that fund and where is it now going?
So I don't have the details of the specific amount of the fund, but I know that the fund is managed by about 4 women's funds organizations, one based in Latin America. We have AWDF based on the African continent, and we also have another organization based in South Asia. And the general principle is that you're putting money in the hands of global South feminist funds to do the work that they are already doing within that context. So to direct resources to feminist organizations and feminist movements within the African continent, South Asian context, and the Latin American context. Yeah.
Thank you. And that's one thing we noticed is there's this shift of governmental as well as philanthropic funds, some of which are featured in the magazine. It's interesting to see that actually materialise. Swatee, over to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would echo everything that Awino has outlined. I think that we really, as a philanthropic sector, need to really think about how we readdress the power balance of aid being something that moves from a developed nation to an underdeveloped nation. And actually how white supremacy is really central and core to the actual paradigm of aid itself. And so I think we also come from a school of thought where we're looking at how do we readdress power balances within that. And I think it's a really important point to emphasize. Really just coming off the back of that and thinking about this article, Feminist Philanthropy. For us, we are a donor collaborative of 11 different funders who came together in 2014. They range from Frida, the Young Feminist Fund, Mama Cash, and Global Fund for Women, so large international women's funds, private foundations such as Nike Foundation, Novo Foundation, Stars Foundation, and they also embrace children's funders, so Global Fund for Children, Empower, and we also work with Plan International and INGO. And really, the reason that you ask is, well, we're all doing stuff in women and girls work. Why did we come together around this? And I think to us, what we have created with Rhythm for Girls speaks to our values of doing feminist philanthropy. It is an act of solidarity, and it's really about the how. For us, we'd seen that girls are at the bottom of every single MDG, every single development indicator. They are the ones that are not going to school. They're the ones that are the highest recipients of gender-based violence. They are the ones who are affected by child marriage. They're the ones that are affected by climate change. They are the indigenous rights activists. These girls, as Awino was saying, girls don't just hold the title of girl, they hold a girl in a community who is subjected to violence, who is subjected to poverty, to class oppression, to race oppression. And for us, we really wanted to recognise that girls needed additional resourcing, because in 2014 there was a World Bank report that said 0.02 cents of every dollar in international aid was going to adolescent girls globally. And we, as a collaborative of donors, wanted to come together to address that power balance. But in setting up Rhythm for Girls, we really wanted to make sure that our funding was getting to groups that were exclusively led by adolescent girls and centred in adolescent girls' realities and decision-making. All of our decisions are taken in a collaborative manner, which speaks to the fact that we are wanting to redress power balances. There is no hierarchies in the way that we work. All of the partners have equal decision making. But more importantly than that, we really wanted to put power and decision making in adolescent girls' hands. How often do you get girls making decisions about their lives, let alone where money sits? There was a report from the ACF that 99% of foundation trustees here in the UK are white. Can you imagine how many from investment committees are white, are men? And we wanted to put all of our decision making for where our grants go in the hands of adolescent girls. We also wanted to make sure that girls were part of the design and the decision making. And when I talk about girls, I talk about girls between the ages of 10 to 19, which is how we think of adolescent girls, who sit at all of those intersections of poverty, of gender, and of age discrimination as well. We also didn't want to focus on any region in particular. There is no place in the world where girls have it better than any other set. of groups, and so our grant making is fully global. We have grantees here in the UK, we have them in the US, in Germany, but we also have them in Mali, in Yemen, in Nicaragua, in Pakistan. So they are all over the world. We also wanted to really address this intersectionality question. So when we were thinking about, do we focus on gender-based violence? Do we focus on girls' access to education? Do we focus on FGM? Do we focus on girls in STEM? The question kept on going to, well, actually, if we put our money into the hands of girls who are deciding about what makes sense for them, they will already address all their intersectionalities. They will address what they want to see happen for themselves and for other girls in their communities. And so we have lots of award, and to speak to the fact that actually we don't have grantees, we have award winners. And this speaks to the fact that girls are already organising. They've been organising for millennium, but we think of them as irrelevant in the conversation, as just victims of recipients of funding and not as power holders in and of themselves, of people who are leading movements. It was so heartening to see Greta Thunberg on the face of Time magazine yesterday. But for every Greta and Malala, there are thousands, if not millions of other girls all around the world who are taking their own decisions. And so for us, we do address intersectionality by really focusing on what girls are doing themselves. And if girls have decided that a project is important, then it deserves awarding, it deserves recognition, it deserves amplification, and it deserves funding. And I think for us, that is our model of how we go beyond grant making. But one thing that I will underscore with all of this is, despite what we are doing, it is not enough. When you look at the amount of funding going to our sister women's funds, that are going to participatory funds such as ours, that are going totally globally, that are putting money and decisions in the hands of the communities, that are the ones that actually face all of these inequities, that face all these inequalities. It's a tiny drop in the ocean, and frankly, it's a joke. It's a joke compared to how much money is going into other issues. And so for me, a central issue that comes from all the articles in this magazine is that yes, there are these amazing projects and initiatives and women's funds that are happening, and they are showing that by changing the how, by addressing all of those questions, there is real power, there is real change to be achieved, but it's simply not enough. Movements are the ones that are the front of everything. If you look around the world right now at the school strikes, at what's happening in Hong Kong, in Lebanon, in Sudan, at the front of it is young feminists, it's girls, it's women who are leading those movements. They're the ones changing narratives. They're the ones demanding a difference in civil society. And Awino really outlined something that I think is really important, which is that these groups are decentralized. We see from the groups that we award and are With and For Girls award winners, they don't conform to hierarchies. They don't have leaders. They work and operate as ecosystems. They're informal, they're unregistered groups. And our job as a collaborative of funders is to recognise the way that they are shaping and they're moving and being able to get our funds to them regardless of those barriers. The fact that they're unregistered and they might be an informal group of 14-year-olds in Yemen should not prevent us getting funding from them because, oh, well, they're not registered and so our funding can't get to them. Our bank account will stop sanctions going to them. It's our role as philanthropists and people who are working in the foundation space to challenge those structures that exist, question them and find new and innovative ways in collaboration with communities to actually push for something better.
Thank you, Swatee. Just thinking about that, our June issue next year will be on social movements and its uneasy relationship with philanthropy, and it's clearly a big issue that's rising about how foundations engage with these movements, particularly when women are leading them. So thank you for bringing that perspective as well. And turn to Moira Sinclair now. And Moira is going to talk about what foundations can be doing, even foundations that don't have a focus on women and girls, to actually push this conversation about gender justice and equality and open up the space for more of the kind of funding that seems to be needed.
Good. So I hope I'm amongst friends this morning, because I think I'm here because we don't have a focus, a specific programmatic focus on women and girls. And before I was asked to come and speak on this panel, I don't think I would have described myself as using feminist funding principles at all in the work that we do. And so I thank the editors of the current issue of Alliance, because it's really made me think long and hard about what we're doing and how we're doing it, and how we behave, and whether we are, in fact, looking through that lens when perhaps we haven't spoken about that. So I emailed everyone in the foundation last Friday, which helped me to gather my thoughts and to respond to the brief. And the responses that came back from them were fascinating, and some of the things that we reflected on were, it's absolutely right, we don't have a specific programmatic focus on feminism or gender equality. But we do say that everything we do is underpinned by social justice. And the minute you put that framing in place, I think it's very difficult not to talk and think about feminism and gender equality. And we've been taking a much more considered approach since we published our strategy in 2015 towards that systematic systems change piece that both our other panel members have talked about. We're much more conscious of the barriers and structures, attitudes and behaviours that need to shift alongside the attention to the immediate need, which perhaps is where the Foundation's history and traditional grant making has been. So what does that mean? We've moved to a more intentional focus on doing something more than alleviating immediate need. Being explicitly interested in supporting organisations that champion voice and agency in many different ways, but that includes funding young women and including trans young women to lead the change that they want to see. And I think that's been a really distinct shift in our grant making over the last few years. We talk specifically and openly about wanting to see an asset-based approach. We are providing longer term funding, and we're providing core funding to organisations. We're funding backbone organisations who are there to create the resources to support lobbying and advocacy work, as well as sustaining the networks that we heard before. And we're bringing people who come from backgrounds that aren't often represented in philanthropy into philanthropy to inform and challenge our approaches as a grant maker and make decisions as our 4 young advisors do now. So they are part of our decision-making process, not just brought in as a sort of token to add some thinking into the process. We have quite a substantial portfolio of grants in the women's rights space. We fund in the UK and in India, although we don't often describe them as such. And I think there is something really interesting in thinking about the visibility of our funding and the way in which we capture what we're doing and why we're supporting those organisations. I also thought a little bit about us as an organisation and how we are operated and how we're structured in much the same way that you do. Women are represented at all levels of our foundation. The ratio of on the board at the moment is 1/3 women to 2/3 men, in line with wider charity stats at the moment in the UK. But our senior leadership team is the other way round. We are 2/3 women to 1/3 men. And Paul Hamlyn Foundation is led by women. Our chair, our chief executive and our chief operating officer are all women. And actually I think that speaks to a number of things which perhaps, I hadn't sort of visibly and explicitly talked about. Our pay gap is positive. Our employment policies are pretty good, with flexible working, good maternity time off in lieu, a whole series of things which are actually important in terms of the culture that we try to create. And we've signed up to do a lot more work in this area. We're part of the new DEI coalition that's been formed coming out of the UK, and our updated strategy, which we'll adopt in the spring, articulates and makes a clearer commitment to diversity, inclusion and equity. So my question was to the team, does it matter if we don't do any more than that? And if we are going to be doing more, what do you think that looks like? So there was a big cluster of responses that said that when we update our strategy, we need to think about how our social justice themes of championing voice and agency, responding to the climate emergency and strengthening civil society really play out for women, especially young women. And we say that we have a particular focus on young people. And I think, again, we need just to think about how those things play out in a number of different fields. That we should be more explicit about the work that we do in this space. But there was a feeling that we didn't need to have a specific fund or focus. The important thing is we talk about what we fund and why we fund this type of work, with an emphasis on the importance of a gendered approach to working. And we do that in the LGBTQ space as well, and that we have some work that exclusively focuses on young men within a gender context, and we should be speaking much more about why we're doing all of those things. That we needed to think about the presence or lack of it of work around intersectionality in our grant making, with a real desire to see this reflected in not just what we do and represent, but in a clear record and analysis of how we review our strategies and priorities going forward. And that would include creating data so we could answer the question, who is encouraged to apply for grants across all of our themes, who actually applies and who is awarded. And that we could have a policy, but the monitoring and analysis of actions and take-up is actually really critical in telling you whether you're going in the right direction or not. All of this has just given me a ton more questions, which I'm now sharing with the group. So how do we get even better at being more comfortable in funding in the messy spaces? And we've had reference to this already. The spaces in between programmatics, but also those sort of unregistered movements and organisations. It's much harder for us to talk about our efficacy as a funder and much more difficult for us to describe that impact. But it's much more real, acknowledging that intersection is where it's happening and that the movement building is where it's happening and that the voice of young women is where it's happening. So how do we get more comfortable in that space? And in particular, how do we get our trustees more comfortable in that space as well? And how do we address the accountability issue whilst being comfortable in those messy spaces? I know asking applicants and successful organisations for more data won't be universally popular. Every time we do a survey with our people, they say, make it light touch, make it as easy as possible. But if we don't capture the data, we can't code it. And if we can't code it, we can't understand what's going on underneath the surface there. So there's a real interesting dilemma for us as philanthropists, as grant makers, in thinking about how do we do that well in a way which doesn't add a burden back into the sector again, but allows us to be really deeply analytical about who we're reaching. Whilst PHF's gender stats are pretty good, the rest of the trusts and foundations stats in the UK are less so. So how could we use our platform to encourage greater movement on that front, whilst not sounding or getting too complacent about it? Could the DEI coalition established by Fawzia be an interesting part of that conversation about shifting things forward? I'm going to end now just saying that this has really stimulated me, and I'm much more positive than I was at the beginning when I started this process, that actually we are using a feminist consciousness. I just, as probably an old school second wave feminist, didn't really think about it in the way that the articles have provoked me to do. One of my team said, there's something about PHF's everyday culture that is supportive of feminism, in that women, and I hope men too, are enabled by ordinary working processes and the arrangement of space and time to feel confident to have open discussions which often touch on gendered realities. This is hard to capture and pin down, but it's critical. It improves the way we fund social justice when staff express and discuss these questions, thoughts and dilemmas. So I think there's something in encouraging everybody to try and create that space within our own organisations, because it really does have a profound impact on the way we behave and the way we make grants.
Thank you, Moira. Sounds like from what you're saying that PHF is a great place to work. So there is obviously a question about the rest of the foundation sector, and you alluded to them and the extent to which progress in terms of gender equality in the wider foundation sector, not just in the UK but elsewhere, is lagging behind, and that might be something to explore a bit more. But I really want to hand the floor over to everybody here for your points of view, your questions and observations. We've got about 45 minutes to have that conversation based on everything that's been said. So please don't be shy and just raise your hands and say where you're from and say anything that's coming to your mind based on what you've heard. Dina.
I'm Esther Thompson from the Association of Charitable Foundations, and our members are some of the people we're talking about today in the room as well. Something that comes to mind is, so talking about funding movements and being comfortable with funding movements, young women's movements or perhaps other movements. I'm wondering about trustees of our members having contact with movements, and I could imagine that the distance is potentially quite big. So if you've grown up in a certain way, you might not have been part of a movement. And I just wondered if this is just a sort of a thought, how we, perhaps ACF or other organisations, bring sort of the reality of what it is to live, the passion and the drive and what it means to be part of a movement, how you bring somebody who's never experienced that, how you bring those two together, sort of. So if you understand something, you're more likely to feel sort of more connected and more likely to fund it or more likely to support it. So I wonder if there's that dissonance, if we could work on bringing that together. Another question.
Does anyone want to respond now? Or would you like to hear a few more? A few more. I saw someone had their hand up at the back there.
Hi. I'm Moira Sinclair. I'm from Fair Faithful Women, which is a grassroots movement campaigning for women's rights on the basis of sex. And sex is a word that I don't think I heard at all this morning. I heard a lot about gender and gender identity and the idea of breaking down the boundary and the binary. And we argue that women's rights as a sex need to recognise that there is a material reality to being born a girl and growing up into a woman, and that we still need a feminist analysis that recognises sex, that women is not a costume or an identity. And that's something that's very difficult to say in the voluntary sector, in foundations now. People lose their job, people get from social media for saying that. And I wanted to ask some of the funders in the room whether in your sort of responding to voice and movements, whether you are open to funding organisations that view women as a sex, in addition to those that take a different view. So, for example, Vancouver Rape Crisis was defunded because they wanted to continue to run a rape crisis centre for women and not allow male people into that rape crisis centre, and they were defunded. And if women's organisations that are serving women are not able to get funding, then there is a pressure on them not to follow their own agency and voice. So I wanted to ask the funders where they stand on that.
Thank you. Some other comments?
Hey, so I'm Rhoda from Side Business School, Oxford University, and just out of interest, maybe this is more targeted to you, Swatee. You said that you work quite globally, and you choose anyone who's a girl to really look at and work with. Out of interest, how do you measure that impact and where your funds go, and how much of that is actually gone into a positive impact, but also a negative, because that happens as well?
Thank you.
What does SEF stand for?
The Association of Charitable Foundations. We're the membership body of trusts and foundations in the UK.
So I think, and I spent a season of my life doing development work on the African continent. So even though I'm here as an academic, or this is where I get paid today, I have a sort of very rooted experience of working for, with, and a deep interest in questions about social justice and transformation. So I think it's important to put that out. I think this idea of bridging is a very important one. I think my caution often is that in 2019, we need to have moved away from transporting people to the field, right? Because I think more often than not, that's how it gets translated, that in order to bring people closer, in order for them to understand the realities, then we go and show them proof. Here are the people we're supporting. This was picture A when they started. This is picture B, how they look. And if we really understand the nature of movements, there's nothing to, there are no people to go and observe. right? Because this is constantly evolving and change is shifting all the time. And I'm wondering whether, rather than allowing people to see, we allow them to see in different ways. You know, whether that is through research, whether that is through providing very visual and contextual analysis that is around us on a day-to-day basis. I know more often than not when I'm starting these conversations, the argument often then moves to the question of impact, right? So how do we know that funding movement X, a collective that is decentralized, will actually translate into value for money? That then forces the question of what therefore is impact, right? If we are assessing impact on the basis of the fact that thousands of people stayed in Tahrir Square and Mubarak left, that is impact. The next stage of the conversation is whether the unseating of Mubarak actually led to a sort of deeper transformational shift. And this is where the continued investments then continue to matter. For those who are interested in, for instance, women's voices in that context, to continue to support that work. And on the African continent, we have seen the kinds of lessons that have been drawn from Tunisia and Egypt into the kinds of conversations that people in Sudan are having now and Algeria are having, because of the recognition that unseating one strongman does not unseat the deep state, you know. And so the conversations are shifting. So it's not longer just about removing the strongman, it's about ensuring that a significant part of their architecture goes with them. And supporting this kind of work means continuity, but it also means that you can't go and see things, right? You have to think about this in a much more expansive way. And perhaps an even radical idea is that maybe we need to think about who are sitting on our board of trustees, right? To sort of do some intergenerational work that allows, of course, the history, those with the deep pockets to continue to remain in those positions, but ensure that we're bringing fresher and younger energies that can also catalyze these conversations from within. I ran a workshop for a bunch of foundations that are based in Europe, and I found it, I'm not going to name the particular foundation, but it's one of the oldest and it's got a lot of deep pockets. But one of the arguments that I found the program officer making, and this was around how do we do better intersectional funding, was around the fact that they made an argument to their board of trustees to say, in the same way that the Bill Gates Foundation and other science-oriented foundations will say that we are going to fund something in order to experiment. We don't know whether it will work, but you have given us enough reason to think that let's go and try it and figure out whether it will get us somewhere. That we need to do this kind of brave work with social justice. So if you're trying to say that you want to do intersectional funding, rather than saying, give us the proof that it works, give us the evidence that if we do this, it results in this, put a pot of money aside, look for grantee partners, award winners, your partners who you want to put an investment in, let them go out and test it, and use that as a basis to actually generate the impact, rather than this circular conversation of, but does feminist funding really work? Give us the evidence so that we can do this. Be brave, be bold, test it. A final point, even though the question was not addressed to me, is around the question of what it means to fund women and girls. And I think there's a sort of very slippery slope that we can get into there around the differences or what it means to think about rape crisis centers that were initially designed to support women and girls. That is a very different kettle of fish from the conversation that is being swallowed today about thinking about trans people. And I think this is where this sort of sex-gender debate ends up taking us to, right? We can talk about the importance of funding women and girls and rape crisis center, but not use that as a euphemism or a way to then say we are being trans-exclusionary. I think we need to be able to hold those two conversations honestly, authentically, and do so in ways that do not end up giving fodder to the Trumps and the anti-right movements that are circulating across the globe and that are impacting and reversing all of the hard work that we have all done that ensures that we are sitting in this room today as people who consider themselves cis women or our women and enjoying the kind of voice and rights that we're enjoying now. We end up in a very tricky place of reversals of all the work and the labor that we have also put into this.
I think on the question around movement experience, I think I echo everything that Awino has said. I also think that funders need to think about how we do the work without just tokenizing and bringing in people from the movement space? What value is there for someone from a movement to be in that dialogue, and why do we feel that we have the power to take them out of their space of energy to actually educate us? Like, we should be, and that's one of the things that I think working in collectives with other funders allows you to gain that experience. You get the experience of what it means to fund movements. When we started With and For Girls, it was housed in SOAS Foundation, which was a private philanthropic foundation that focused on children and young people. We didn't know about some of the dynamics of gender that sat at the time that we did it, and that's why we decided to actually work in a collaborative with other funders who were working on those issues, because we didn't want to disrupt what was happening around the world. And I think that alongside what Awino is saying, I think that we do need to think about how do we educate ourselves and how do we actually use spaces of collaboration within philanthropy to actually learn from one another and not put that burden on movements or on communities themselves. I think to the question on sex, I think I would again agree and echo what's already been said along that. I think it's hard to hold well, I don't think it's hard to hold. I think it's hard to hold the two conversations and not provide that fodder. I think we need to be aware that people are facing multiple inequities in communities around the world, and those ones that are trans are even further impacted by patriarchy, by all of the systems of oppression, and services need to be thinking about how we actually bring those in.
My question was about women. Is it possible to talk about women?
We are called With and For Girls, and for us we absolutely hold up the power of girls. That does, as a sex. We don't discriminate, and we hold a very, very open terminology. And for us to dictate what we understand as girls compared to what girls understand themselves to be in all communities around the world, I think is an unfounded thought for us. So when we talk about girls, it's about putting that definition of what it means to be a girl in the hands of girls themselves. I'm not an adolescent girl. I'm not an adolescent girl in Yemen. I'm not an adolescent girl in Mali. I'm not an adolescent girl in the Solomon Islands. That reality of what it means to be a girl, to identify as a girl, should sit with who that person is in those communities.
Do you believe that those, you know, the people who have less opportunity in schools or political child marriages choose to be in that situation because they choose that identity, or is it because they're born female?
They're born they're born female in systems of oppression. But what we've also seen from our work is that by taking a girl-focused lens and by girls leading in their community, there's a research report that came out last week from Columbia University that when you take a girl-focused lens, you actually end up meeting the needs of LGBTIQ youth and boys and other groups in your community as a way of doing that. So holding up that way of approaching it and actually putting your decision making in the hands of those communities that want to have their own reality and want to dictate how they identify themselves, whether that identity is given to them as a frame or whether they've self-identified it. That is not for us to uphold or to define. That is for us to support and amplify what they are making decisions on. And I think on the third point around the measurement, what I would say to that is that around measurement, what are we measuring and who are we measuring it for? I often sit in meetings around data and what we're doing within the philanthropic sector, and usually it's a bunch of us, people sat in the global north, mainly white, who are deciding what impact looks like in communities and what change looks like, and then building indicators and data sets that prove our reality. We then pass on formats and forms to communities and say, we only see value in what you're doing and impact in what you're doing if you can fill in these things that show that change has happened in this way, as opposed to be in dialogue and discussion with communities as to what change really means, what are the unintended changes that have happened as a result of the approaches that they've taken. And for us, we do continually dialogue with the groups and award winners that we work with around the world. We try and understand their realities, and we do work with academics. We've done research reports with Columbia University. We're doing one at the moment with the Institute of Development Studies. We've worked with lots of other funders and groups such as the McKinseys. If they want to interrogate the systems and define what they understand to be impact, we will absolutely open up that discussion. But for us, the value in what's happening is defined by those communities, and so we keep our reporting formats and tools at the very minimal so that it provides space for that dialogue to be understood, and we can hopefully try and readdress the power balance by not defining how success or defining how impact looks like, but providing an open-ended enough questions that they can actually dialogue with us and tell us what change looks like and what challenges look like for them.
And that more trust-based model of philanthropy really comes across in quite a lot of the articles in the issue.
The only thing I would say is that the challenge about that is then whether we can answer the question about whether we're reaching the right groups and whether we're open or whether we're unintendedly excluding people because we're not capturing the data which shows us that. And that tension is something that we sit and hold at the moment. And I think that's, I don't have the solution to it. I'd love someone to wave a magic wand, but there is something there about the need for us to have some way of both capturing learning on an individual grant basis, which I think is the learning for the organisation, but also recognising that as grant makers, if we want to be as equal and open as possible, we need to understand what we're doing and to work out how to do that at scale effectively.
And just to quickly respond to that, I do think that when we talk about data, I think it's about how do we work in solidarity as people in philanthropy to address those questions. So I think that, you know, the collaborative of women's funds called Prospera, they've done a lot of mutual investment across what's happening. AWID, the Association for Women in Development, they've also commissioned large pieces of research that speak exactly to that. If you look, there was a large research paper that we can circulate afterwards by Hatun, who looked at data sets from 170 countries over a 30-year period that showed that the only thing that was actually changing violence against women was continual funding to women's funds and to women's movements in countries. That is like a long-term academic, multi-country study that's proving that women's movements, that women's funds are having impact. I agree that more might need to be interrogated, different lenses might need to be applied, but it's one that philanthropy needs to take as a combined challenge and not just one that one foundation or one set of funders can necessarily address in isolation to do so. And I think that's why the power of collaborations, the power of groups such as AWID and others are so important in resourcing within the feminist philanthropy ecosystem.
I just wanted to add to the point on data, which I totally agree with you. I think it's always, as a researcher, I think it's important to collect all kinds of information, quantitative, qualitative information over time. And I think my observation in working with different women's funds in particular is that perhaps there needs to be much more systematic collection of this information from the beginning so that you do not arrive at end-of-term evaluation and all of a sudden all your grantee partners are overwhelmed with all of this stuff you need to collect. But it's something that you can do incrementally over time. And I must say, for instance, an organization such as Okech collects some very significant and substantive data in ways that do not put too much pressure on the people that they're working with, who they know are busy, but they're sitting on a lot of very rich data. So I think it can be done. Now the next question is what you do with it, because a lot of people are sitting with this information. And so the partnerships that you're talking about are absolutely critical.
More questions, observations? You at the back.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I work for ActionAid. We're an international NGO that focuses on women and girls and driven by feminist principles. And outside of how we manage our programs and how we work with our partners, we're also looking at who funds our work. Our philanthropy is kind of made up by 60% men and 20% couples, and we're really looking at how do we work with and engage more female philanthropists, and so just really kind of to the panel about ideas and how we do that in a different way to traditional philanthropy, and how can we kind of work with and educate and engage the philanthropists more.
Hey,
My name is Leah Warrow. I work for the NGO Independent Diplomat. I think there's been quite a lot of very interesting discussion about funding grassroots work, activist work. And what we do at Independent Diplomat is to try to help marginalized voices get into the diplomatic sphere. So the UN, the EU, Human Rights Council in Geneva. And of course to get marginalized voices in peace negotiations. One of the things that we consistently see in working with women is that donors are more keen to support in general the kind of grassroots level that they see women should be involved in. That women are peacemakers, they're humanitarians, and yet when it comes to actually getting them around the table in negotiations, they're nowhere to be seen. In the Yemen negotiations in Stockholm, for example, there was one single woman. A lot of that, I think, comes down to in terms of major government funding, to this question that they are both the ones giving the money and also the ones often hosting negotiations and supporting those, and want just to make the thing work and see that adding women into the mix or forcing non-state parties into the mix makes it complicated. So I guess my question for you is what do you think these kind of innovative forms of grants like the one Swatee you're talking about and philanthropy can do to kind of bridge that gap between the activist and the grassroots level and the political decisions that affect, communities, often women as much or more than men.
Thank you. Take one more if there is one more.
Hi, I'm Geraldine from London Funders, so I'm going to go completely the other way from the international to local. I'll be interested in your perspectives because we talked a lot about movements, but how does that work against funding mainstream charities and organisations that do have an ear to government to discuss some of the issues of today? So for instance, the APPG report showing that universal credit is directly leading to more women going to prostitution, and the fact that there will be some mainstream charities that have the data and the policy voice to get on with trying to tackle this versus the movements.
Should we start with you, Moira?
Do I have a solution to getting more women into philanthropy? I'll come back to that one in a minute. I think there is something that we can do in those bridging, and actually I think the bridging is quite similar in both the last two speakers, the sort of sense of activists and grassroots into negotiation spaces, and also what the role of mainstream charities could or should be. We fund both, so we fund at both levels. We absolutely see that there's a real importance to that grassroots and activist and movement building work, and we can see that there are other forms of influence that need to be supported. So I talked about the fact that we fund those backbone organisations. We fund leadership programmes because we can see, and we fund organisations who are working with young people to give them the voice and agency to become the leaders of the future, and to absolutely see that pathway through, and to make sure that that doesn't sit within a kind of mentoring space but actually goes into a sponsorship space, so that you start to see those voices of young people and young women represented at the right tables and in that negotiating space. And as I said, that includes ourselves. So we have to model that behaviour and bring young women into making within our own foundation, and that gives them a really interesting platform to different places. We're also funding or working in partnership with a number of APPGs actually, because there is a space there which I think is not political with a big P, but really can be a very influential space, a safe space actually for a number of different political persuasions to come together to shift the dial on some of this stuff and to learn together rather than trying to have the one-on-one conversations every time. I think the women in philanthropy is really interesting. I mean, the reality has been that the money has sat with men for many, many years, and that's only just beginning to shift at a systems level within my world, which is the North and the UK. As that shift is happening, I am seeing more women coming into the space and being interested in the space and being interested in some of the issues that we've talked about today, bringing their experience and their lived experience of gender, of sex into the space and wanting to do something about it. I think it's always, I think when we talk about philanthropy, it's often with the very deep pockets in mind, the Gateses and the Zuckerbergs of this world, and maybe there's a bit of framing to do there, that actually I can be a philanthropist. I chair a small dance company in East London, and I am a philanthropist in my own right in that context, but I'm not giving them billions of pounds. My time and a small amount of money can make an enormous amount of difference to the activity that we're able to deliver through that organisation. And I think that reframing that philanthropy is not just about the billions and the corporates, and is much more about the relationship, the relational sense of what you can bring to your community or to your cause, needs to be kind of amped up a bit more.
Yeah, I think just to piggyback on that, I think with motivating female philanthropists, I think that it'd be great for you to speak with kind of the community foundations, because they do exactly as Moira was saying. They are foundations that are completely, all the decisions are run by the community, but the funding comes from that community, because communities around the world do have power and they have agency, and there's a way of coming together. And I think to really think about embracing new philanthropy in the future is really about bringing people together for shared learning and understanding. Because I think, to the point that Esther was making earlier, let's try and create a space where people are safe enough to question each other, to critique one another, to challenge and push one another, and let's do that in absence of needing to bring people from the community in just to, like, as fodder for us, but bring them in as real partners to help inform and help set agendas with us. So I think that would be my comments on that. I think in terms of the bringing grassroots voices and into places of power, I do think that's an important one, and I think it kind of, my answer would tally with the question around how do we link up the work that movements are doing with the kind of work that more established organisations are doing. I think we need to also understand that movements are constantly shaping, and they're not just, like, movements are so multifaceted, they also include those actors within them. Like, movements come from the grassroots, but those people come from the community, and they could be politicians, they could be decision makers, they could be other ways. I think the fact that movements come together so quickly and we need to get funding to them in that moment means that they then have the space and the leverage to be able to build those intergenerational, intersectional dialogues with other stakeholders and actors in their community. So I wholeheartedly believe that, and I think for us, when we structured what the With and For Girls Awards should look like, you know, the groups that we're always super inspired by are the ones that are girl-led, where the oldest member of the organisation is a 17-year-old. But we also recognise that groups that are more established in the community, that are run by adults, that are run by other community members, are also really important to girls, as long as they take a girl-centred approach, which for us means that where projects are about deciding about girls' realities, they are at the decision-making table. They're helping to build strategies and work plans and to make decisions about money and strategy. And so I think from that perspective, like, we do look at that tiered approach, that how do we support those that are really at the front lines of the movements, and how do we also recognise the kind of bigger shift that needs to happen within civil society as a whole. And I think to the question on the amplifying voices, I think, again, you know, there is an inherent power that sits within philanthropy. We are power holders as people with funding and money, and for us, what we do at With and For Girls is not only does all of our grant making decisions go in the hands of adolescent girls to choose who our funders go to, but funding goes to, we give that long-term core support, but most importantly, we try and use our positions of power to get space for girls to enter those. So I did ask Charles if a girl could be here. Unfortunately, it didn't work out, but we do, I think that us as people in philanthropy and those that hold power need to also think about what doors we can open. We've taken girls to speak at large events. We had 11 girls from With and For Girls winners around the world run the closing plenary of the Human Rights Funders meeting. So they addressed 1,000 of the world's biggest human rights funders with their own demands, with their own realities, and their pledges and their discussions were put in a report by the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, and he's now in dialogue with girls directly. So I think we also need to think about how do we innovatively get people into those spaces. We absolutely should be working across philanthropy with who are the actors that are specifically working on that, but also how can we open up those spaces and those corridors of power to girls, to women, to other community members, using our own power and leverage to do that as well.
And if I can ask, how can that be done to achieve the impact you want within the philanthropy sector? Because the aspiration you're describing and the results you're highlighting have a spirit of insurgency about them. There's these possibilities of change, these possibilities of opening up these doors. But it seems a world away from the current reality of a more hierarchical, elite-focused foundation sector that exists today, not just here, but in our magazine we've got a feature about the German foundation sector, where only 3 women out of over 30 senior foundation leaders are women. So I'm just wondering, what, in the spirit of challenge, what do you think needs to be done or can be done within the foundation sector to maybe increase the extent of kind of gender equality within the sector? And I just wonder whether I could put that question to Moira. You've mentioned the Diversity Coalition, but what strategies are there, or what do you think needs to happen beyond the Paul Hamlyn Foundation?
I was just thinking about that, what you're doing with the young women and bringing them into space, and there's something, I think there's something quite exposing for people in being philanthropists actually at the moment, and I hear increasingly people anxious about the kind of public platform of being a philanthropist, and a lot of anxiety about that power dynamic and how do you manage that, and are you saying you're the expert or that you're the one with the money if you put yourself into that space. So I think there probably is a strategy about those of us who are women working in the philanthropic space being comfortable about being on those platforms and being a bit more visible about that. There has been a significant shift in the UK in the last 5 years, even in the last 5 years. And when I think back to when I was running charities and on the other side, it felt like everyone who ran a philanthropic organisation in the UK was a man in his 50s wearing a blazer who came from the military sector. It was a very odd dynamic, and you never understood why they were the people who would, it was something to do with trust and money, I think, probably. And when I look around my peers now, and you look at those top 30 or top 300 foundations, ACF, there are a number of women now running those, and running both the money side and the grant-making side as well. And there's something about us being comfortable with the sense of we are holding that power and we're trying to do something to the best with it. But we have to be able to talk about that and to recognise those women in that space in some way and to see them. And sometimes I think our default is actually to be doing really good work really quietly, because we're actually worried about the power dynamic and therefore we want to be modest and we pull back from that space. And sometimes we have to find a dialogue that makes it more comfortable to both be those women and then to challenge others to move into that space as well, to be on the recruitment panels, to work with the right recruitment agencies. We heard that at the start of this morning, to sponsor women, other women, the women we're bringing on and up, not just mentoring them, but actually making the introductions, bringing them into the space, encouraging them into the next roles. And we have a responsibility as women to pass it on or to do that.
I can see quite a few heads nodding, and it seems like it might resonate with some of you. So if anyone wants to comment on what they've heard from Moira, Awino, and then Esther, and then more responses.
One of the things that we in the academic sector think very critically about is the notion of the pipeline, right? And for me in particular, and for many of us in the sector now, it's a question about black women academics. I don't know whether you all know this, but there are only 5 black women professors in the UK. And in the pipeline conversation, what we have had to do is thinking about how we structure our hiring job applications. And that if you put in a few keywords, you are likely to shift the demographic of who applies for these jobs. So I think there's a question about being comfortable and owning it, but there's also a deeper question about the pool of people that we attract based on how we write up a job application. And I think this is something for us to really think critically about encouraging a different type of person to apply for these jobs and to do all of that important work that Moira is pointing out, of pushing them through the pipeline. So it's not enough to get people into a space within which they're already feeling uncomfortable and an odd person in. But to ensure that they get through the pipeline is also a critical part, which also means we must be ready to leave, once you reach a certain level, and create the space for others to come through, especially in environments where there's a ceiling, right? There's only so far you can go. Yeah. So that means that it reaches a point where you have to exit stage and allow others to come through. I wanted to speak to the question about women at the table. And I think that there is something for us to think very seriously about what people are comfortable hearing from particular groups of people from certain parts of the world. So I think that there's an element about the tension between state and non-state actors, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper. I think that there are very many sectors and parts of our society who are more comfortable with hearing African women, Asian women, women from the different parts of the global south offering testimonies. And that is the only way through which we can conceptualize their engagement with any space, whether it's the peace building table or whether it's global advocacy spaces at CSW or other spaces. And this idea that certain people are activists or grassroots activists are the doers. So all that they can come and do is to talk about the doing. And we create this disconnection between the doing and the analysis is something that we must also break. Yeah. So we also need to stop inviting people and framing, again back to keywords, framing the invitation about come and tell us your story. Because the minute you say come and tell us your story, you're priming me to come and give you a case study. You're not priming me to connect that case study and my experiences with the structural dynamics that creates that case study. So I think that the reason why people are hesitant, yes, it's the non-state dynamic, but we also like hearing stories. And that's the only way we want to see particular groups of women from certain parts of the world. And that's a power question. And I think our responsibility is to shift that dynamic as well. And to recognize that the fact that somebody like me is sitting here does not necessarily mean that I'm detached from the realities of people in the country that I come with. Because I think it's these kinds of disconnections that are also made as well. That when you see a strong black African woman talking, they're like, no, that one has too much Western education, which I don't. Oh, that one has this. So I need to get the real person, the woman on the ground, And the woman on the ground that you're looking for is the one who you want to hear their story. I can produce many stories if I wanted to. I have them, and it's not stories of other people, my own stories. But I refuse for that to be the way in which people see me or the ways in which I engage with different platforms.
I would just add to what's been said by just saying that I think we do need to think about how does the philanthropic sector mirror the communities that we're actually wanting to work with, and that is going to make people feel uncomfortable, and but it's one that we do need to uncomfortably address. And really reflect on and look at where that can be achieved. I think that we do need to change, like, who are the decision makers. We can do that in ways like participatory grant making approaches, like changing people on boards. There's a brilliant program called the 2027 program that's being funded by a number of different funders in the space. I think you guys are one of them, but it's about coaching young people from different intersectional realities to actually enter the philanthropic sector as trustees, as decision makers, as leaders. And so we really need to be thinking about that, like the DEI coalition. But more than that, I think using whatever platform and space we have, not just as people of colour, but as white allies as well, to question those power dynamics from the spaces that we all sit in as well.
So talking of white allies, men, how important is it to have more men in the room for this conversation and persuade them of the importance of it and for everybody?
I will go first. I think it's incredibly important. I counted 12 men, one who's left. So I thank you for obviously coming to this, but I think one of the things that we really need to embrace is the fact that feminism is just calling out where inequity sits. It's not saying that inequity is just, or equity is just for one person or one set of groups. And I think feminist philanthropy is the same. It lifts up everyone in the community, but it recognises that the specific realities of groups are important, and I think it's incredibly important. But what I would say to that is I also have sat in boardrooms of by decision makers who have been boards of men, and the word feminism is sometimes polarising in those spaces. I don't think that that's particularly helpful. I don't particularly agree with it, but I also feel that people in philanthropy are code switchers. It's our role to come up with different and innovative ways to approach the reality of the conversation, and to try and push people to a space where those words don't feel strange or frightening, but they actually embrace all those realities. So yeah, I'm just acknowledging the fact that it is difficult, but it's also our role, like, to push those in different ways and to really enact the code switching that sits kind of at the heart of what we do as people in the foundation space as well.
Can I say that I think that the men in the room also do need to do the work with their fellow men? I say this because I think that there's a limit to how much labor you can expect of feminist organizations, people doing the feminist work, to continuously do this reaching out. We've been doing it for over 4, 5, 6 decades. And I think, I always believe that there reaches a point where if people are not in the room, there's a willful refusal to not be in the room. I think we've manipulated the words, we have depoliticized the words, we have made it more palatable. What more are we going to do without stripping it of its very essence? And so there's the importance of doing the reaching out, and I think for the men who are allies, who work within organizations, who are persuaded of the importance of a feminist analysis to their work, I think they need to do the allyship of them reaching out to other institutions and other men in other organizations to do that bridging work. Because this is what allyship is about. I think we cannot say that I'm persuaded, now you, Swatee, go and get the others, you know. That means that you're not leveraging the power that patriarchy has given you, which is the fact that you're existing in a society in which it is likely that men are going to hear you better when you talk about these issues, you know. So do the bridge building work. We will give you the tools and the analysis if that's what needs to happen. But let's limit this expectation of feminist organizations to feel that there's something they're lacking if they walk into a room and it's only women or queer people that are in the room and are interested in the politics. Because I think this is what has produced, again, this wave of defunding of feminist organizations, because people are saying, well, you're not engaging men and boys. I would argue that the feminist project has been about engaging the systems of patriarchy that are rooted in talking to men and boys. When we're speaking to power, we're speaking to men and boys. So we are engaging them. This would be my extremist response.
Seems reasonable to me. And it's, well, on that inspirational note, I think we're going to have to wrap up. I really appreciate your words of inspiration and all of your inspiration too, and for what you've brought to the discussion today. Just a few final words of closing. First of all, to thank the Aga Khan Foundation for hosting us here, for Oxford HR for being a feminist recruiter and for being here and sponsoring this panel. We'll be back looking at indigenous philanthropy on the 25th of March at the Museum of London. You can see Amy in the corner there if you want to subscribe to Alliance today and then come for free and get reduction on your subscription. I should also add, just on the note of feminist philanthropy, that we'll be continuing to cover themes of gender equality in the sector. We found there isn't really sufficient data on the gender pay gap in foundations, and we're looking to produce some data and some analysis about that, and we've already done some perceptual surveys on the topic. So it will be a theme that will continue at Alliance, and much of that is because of the thanks of colleagues like Zibran and Amy who are there, who do a lot of the hard work. So you can just join me in briefly thanking them today for their work. One or two other brief comments. We're also hoping to produce a comment to hear about your dilemmas in the sector, ethical challenges, practical issues through, excuse the gendering, but an agony aunt kind of feedback. And so if you have experiences that you want to share and you want a response, so you can send them in to us at alliancemagazine.org, and we'll hopefully be producing a new column that will respond to some of those issues. Some of them may be around gender, but a whole range of issues in the philanthropy sector, to try to get some kind of feedback loops going there. And letters to us about anything you've heard today or in this issue are also welcome, so feel free to send them over. But most of all, thanks for being part of this Alliance community that continues. We try to hold up a mirror to the field, open a space to be critical friends of the sector, and we do want your feedback, and I certainly want feedback to make sure that we do what we do better. But thank you. Go out and vote for the most feminist party or people, and see you at the next event. Thank you very much.